तो नव ना
हाँ हिस्ट्री ऑफ फिलोसफी एबे हबो
माने पेपर रीडिंग
आज्ञा सर आज्ञा सर
गोटे मिनिट okay thank you now I request the sectional president history of philosophy Dr. Nirupama madam to chair this session. In this section there are 8 paper readers before lunch we have to conclude this session. Please madam proceed.
Thank you, Lekha, and a very good noon to all. Am I audible?
Yes, you are audible.
Thank you very much, and a very good noon to all. And first of all, I have expressed my happiest gratitude to all the organizers to giving me such a prestigious chairmanship. And after all, I welcome all the symposists as paper reader. And the first paper reader is Subrat Kumar Parida from Girard College. And his paper is The Concept of Meaning, a Critical Exposition on Linguistic Analysis. I welcome and request Sri Parida to present his paper. Is Parida?
I think he is not available. You can next.
Yeah.
He is not available.
Oh. The next presentation is by Dr. Ramakanta Nanda, retired reader, Godavari Mahavidyalaya, and his paper is The Concept of Reality in Sri Aurobindo's Philosophy. And I welcome once again to Dr. Ramakanta Nanda. Is he present?
Ramananda is there. He's presenting.
Sir.
Am I audible, sir?
Yes, sir. Sir, you are audible.
Yes. Good afternoon, everybody. Respected President Ma'am, Nirupa, and my teachers, Dr. P.K. Mahapatra, Dr. S.K. Mahanti, G.P. Das, Dr. G.P. Das, and all the eminent professors of my time and the present time. I am very much grateful to AOPA to accepting my paper in the history of philosophy session. Without taking much of your time, let me present the paper. The name of my paper is Concept of Reality in Sri Aurobindo's Philosophy. Let me read out the paper. In the contemporary Indian philosophy, Sri Aurobindo is regarded as a neo-Vedantin. He has great contribution towards philosophical thinking. He discusses the concept of reality, evolution, yoga, consciousness, psychic being, supermind, etc. Sri Aurobindo, the prophet of life divine, should be regarded as one of the greatest mystic philosophers in the history of philosophy. He has given a new orientation to the concept of reality in the Vedanta system. He has given the interpretation of reality and Upanishadic concept of Brahman or Satchidananda in the light of 20th century science. His philosophy is the bridge of thought between spirituality and science. The spiritualistic negation of the physical world, the refusal of the ascetic and materialistic denial of the spiritual world. According to Sri Aurobindo, the reality is Satchidananda. It is the Brahman, the divine. It is supreme bliss, the free, abundant activity and absolute passivity. It is absolutely indeterminate, eternal, and infinite calmness. Only a perfect man can realize the divine calmness within himself and perceive the spontaneous flow of energies from its silence to work in the universe. The ultimate reality is utterly transcendent and indescribable. Sri Aurobindo is aware of the scientific development which regards energy underlying all phenomena as one ultimate principle of existence. Sri Aurobindo does not regard physical energy as the ultimate and reality underlying the entire universe because we cannot explain the life, mind, spirit, and higher values with this. To explain the relation between physical world and supreme reality, Satchidananda, he coined the new word involution. The Satchidananda is all pervasive. It is the super consciousness came down within bracket involuted to nescience and has taken different forms in the physical world. Sri Aurobindo conceives that divine involves into the matter through the process of involution, and matter evolves up to the level of divine through the process of evolution. These two processes are called the order of descent and ascent. The concept of reality in Hegel is interpreted in terms of thought. To Hegel, thought is reality. Bradley regards reality as the undivided harmonious whole of experience, in which all aspects of experience are included. In the philosophy of Bergson, Heraclitus, and the Buddhist, reality is pure becoming. Sri Aurobindo, like the Vedanta, denies the absolute reality of becoming and holds that becoming is only the movement of being or pure existence. Reality in Sri Aurobindo should not be regarded as unknown and unknowable, as Kant and Spencer believe. When man transcends the limitation of his personality, he can go back to the absolute in a supreme identity. He says, I quote, "It is indefinable and inconceivable by finite and defining mind. It is ineffable by mind created speech. It is describable neither by our negation, neti, nor for we cannot limit it by saying it is not this, nor that, nor by our affirmation, for we cannot fix it by saying it is this, is that, iti. And yet, though in this way unknowable to us, it is not altogether and in every way unknowable. It is self-evident to itself, and although inexpressible, yet self-evident to a knowledge of identity of which the spiritual being in us must be capable, for that spiritual being is in its essence and its original and intimate reality not other than this supreme existence." Sri Aurobindo conceives Brahman as integral reality, all embracing, omnipresent and omnipresent, omniscient and omnipotent. It is not only one without second, but also all this is Brahman. Sarvam khalu idam Brahman. All is God and God is all. It is all pervasive. It is both transcendent and immanent. It is indivisible. As Veda says, Purnamadam, Purnamidam, Purnat Purnamudachyate, Purnasya Purnamadaya, Purnameva Vasishyate. Whatever we see in the different forms of absolute reality, although it is indescribable, yet from the point of view of the human consciousness, it can be said that reality has a threefold character. It is true in principle. It is existence, Sat, consciousness, force, Chit, and bliss, Ananda. Hence, Sri Aurobindo refers reality as Satchidananda. These three Satchidananda are one trinity, Satchidananda. They are not three different factors making a single sum, neither are only two of them merely attribute, even inseparable and invariable attributes of the third. No doubt, they are always coexistent. They do not exist separately because they are not different from each other. All three are one thing. All three are one thing in itself, seen diversely, seen sensationally, touching the fibers of consciousness, conscious life it is derived, seen mentally, touching the fibers of living consciousness, it is comprehension, seen spirituality, touching the very core of this living and conscious, it is being, but the thing in itself is one. It is Brahman. According to Sri Aurobindo, the Satchidananda Brahman is both being and becoming. He holds the view that being or one is the being or the one is the essentiality of all multiplicity or of many. All evolution is the outward form of the absolute one and its becoming. The pure existence. We can discover in all phenomena the elements of the divine in various forms. Existence is absolutely present in all. Existence is absolutely present in all, from soul to matter. The existence, Sat, of Brahman appears to us as Atman, self, Ishvara, God, or divine being, and Purusha, conscious being or spirit. In Vedanta, existence is unconceived to a universal, ineffable reality. But the evidence advanced in the support of this is that an analysis of the three aspects of life, waking life, dream, and state of dreamless sleep, reveals the universal and indefinable status of existence. Sri Aurobindo feels that science also has its relational apprehension of the reality. The energy discovered by science is boundless. It is impossible to bind it in terms of our measures of space and time. Space and time create their own limitations, and the pure existence cannot be bound by any limiting factors. It is boundless, not because it is infinitely extended in space and time. Hence, the pure existence cannot be conceived by our limited experience, and it is the ground of all existences, cosmic and individual, and is necessarily indeterminate. It is beyond all kinds of attributes of this phenomenal world. Then consciousness force. According to Sri Aurobindo, Satchidananda is only the pure existence, but also the consciousness force. As we have seen that, I quote, the absolute is neither being or becoming, neither one or many, but is beyond both. Stability and movement, unity and multiplicity are in fact our mental representation of the absolute. On the other hand, we have seen that our insight into the nature of reality reveals itself as boundless energy, as infinite existence. The truth is that these two ways of apprehending the absolute are not opposed to each other. Consciousness force is inherent in existence. Shiva and Kali, Brahman and Shakti are one and not two who are separable. Force inherent in existence may be at rest, or it may be in existence, may not be. Force inherent in existence may be at rest, for it may not be in motion, but when it is at rest, it exists nonetheless and not abolished, diminished, or in any way essentially altered. The Purna Advaitin says the consciousness Chit of Brahman, which is always a force, Shakti, manifest as Yogamaya, Shakti and Prakriti. Consciousness force, the own nature of the divine, measures the immeasurable, informs the forms of consciousness, informs the formless and embodies the spirit. The three forms of consciousness force correspond to three aspects of pure existence: Atman, Ishvara, and Purusha. These three forms also exist fundamentally in an inseparable union with the three corresponding aspects of existence. Hence, there is no contradiction in saying that the absolute is both pure existence and consciousness force. Then come to bliss. Among the three aspects of the absolute, the delight of existence or bliss is one of them. Satchidananda is not only Sat or Chit, but also Ananda. Brahman is infinite bliss or infinite delight of the creative play of the force. The Satchidananda, through his consciousness force, manifests himself as this world out of sheer bliss. Bliss gives us the why of creation. Out of bliss, all things arise, says the Taittiriya Upanishad. As Sri Aurobindo observes, world existence is the ecstatic dance of Shiva, which multiplies the body of the God numberlessly to the view. It leaves that while existence crazily where and what it was. Ever is and ever will be its sole absolute object is the joy of the dancing. This joy of dancing or bliss is also universal and ineffable as pure existence or consciousness force. But here a question arises: if the Satchidananda is infinite bliss or self-delighted, how do the suffering, pain and evil exist in the universe? As answer to this question, S.K. Maitra says that the presence of evil and pain in no way contradicts the universal principle of bliss, which is the motive force of the whole universe. Sri Aurobindo is aware of these problems and holds that enjoy is infinite so long as he confines himself in the form of limitations. To attain it, he has to transcend all kinds of limitations and rise high. He believes that man in his fragmentary and partial bliss is destined to enjoy supreme bliss by undergoing triple transformation: the psychic, the spiritual, and supramental in the course of cosmic evolution. These are the three triple transformations, that is psychic, the spiritual, and supramental in the course of cosmic evolution. Conclusion. Sri Aurobindo through evolution has given a fine picture of reality or Brahman, which is already asserted in the Upanishad and also in Shankara Vedanta. His Sachidananda seems to be Ishvara of Shankara, which is immanent in the evolutionary process. His reality can be realized only by the mystic seers and yogins. He is able to reflect the urge of the Vedas, Upanishads, and Bhagavad Gita. While discussing about the concept of reality, as V.P. Verma rightly says, he is very significant interpreter of Indian philosophy, tradition, idealism, and historic culture. Integral non-dualism or Purna Advaitavada of Sri Aurobindo has tried to grasp all the intellectual, spiritual, and epistemological metaphysical theories in a single whole, not rejecting any of the expositions, has honestly kept them in their own state as an evolutionary necessity and advanced his own theory of integral and non-dualism, which affirms the reality of Satchidananda manifests itself in three modes of existence: supracosmic transcendence, cosmic universality, and unique individuality, which again ascend the reach of its own form. It is a play of involution and evolution, the cosmic Leela, homecoming of the divine in a spiritual way. Thank you.
मैडम म्यूट अनम्यूट करंतु निरुपमा मैडम हेलानी मैडम म्यूट कर अनम्यूट करंतु
गोटे माइक्रोफोन चित्र थिबो सेते करन ना लखन
हाँ सर
Hello.
हाँ
Hello.
हाँ हाँ यस
Okay, sir. So your explanation about Sachidananda, the ultimate bliss and existence, is very expressive and beautiful. Thank you, sir. Thank you again. And due to the shortage of time, here I call upon the next reader, the Group of God. And the reader is The Argument from Religious Experience by Dr. K.M. Narayana. Sir, you're very, very welcome to the symposium. K.M. Narayana, sir.
Okay. Thank you, madam. Thank you, madam. Namaskar, everybody. Respected advisor, president, vice president, secretary, and other office bearers of OPA, 33rd session of OPA, sectional president, co-speaker, and other participants. There is a disturbance somewhere. Okay, somewhere there is a disturbance. Okay, now it is clear. Now it is okay. Okay. I am going to present a paper under the title Proof of God, the Argument from Religious Experience. The paper is as follows. Various proofs have been extended to prove the existence of God in the form of ontological argument, teleological argument, cosmological argument, and moral argument. But the proof that I am going to extend herein is a proof based on the direct religious experience. This proof is quite different from all other proofs that I have just listed, for the reason that this proof is directly based on one's own religious experience. Now, what is this religious experience? Religious experience is a special kind of experience that is different and distinct from all other forms of experience. One may be in a particular religious fold or maybe practicing some religion, but still he may not be having any sort of religious experience. It is not just putting oneself in a certain group or a cult or a sect that makes him religious. Unless and until there is no realization on one's part about his own true nature, there cannot be a religious experience. Religious experience presupposes purity, discipline, sincerity, and devotion. Religious experience is an experience of the spiritual life within. But because of our body and sense organs, we move to or we tend to move out of our own individual selves to experience the transitory material world of existence, which in fact is not the real existence. The sooner we realize the limitations of the material world and the reality of the spiritual spark within us, we are in the path of a true experience of God, an experience that is direct, immediate, and also beyond description. This experience, however, is possible only when we have a true realization of our own selves, as most of us fail to realize our own true nature. We fail to realize God. But sooner we come out of the limitations of the body, sense organs, and ego and reflect inward, there is a spiritual calm and tranquility that elevate us to the level of the divinity. Here it is worth referring to Sri Paramahansa Yogananda, who in his book, just a minute, in his book, The Science of Religion, has said that the proof of the existence of God lies in ourselves. It is an inner experience. We can recall at least one or two moments in our lives, whether it may be in prayer or worship, where we might have felt a sort of a bliss and contentment within. This kind of feeling of say a contentment, a sense of contentment, or a blissful feeling inward, though may be a higher kind of experience, and it may not often come to all, yet there can be no doubt that all men at some point or the other, in various points in their lives, have or might have enjoyed a few moments of unalloyed peace and bliss within. He raises a question: is not this feeling be taken, or whether this feeling be not be taken as a proof for the existence of God? What direct proof can we give of the existence and nature of God other than the existence of bliss in ourselves, may it be in our real prayer or worship or in any act of our lives? So for Yogananda Paramahansa Yogananda, the experience of a true bliss in prayer and worship proves the existence of infinite bliss, which he takes as God. The proof of God's existence by the argument from religious experience may constitute the following points, or what are the arguments that we can put forth to prove the existence of God from religious experience. So firstly, most of us, as I said just now, that most of us in some form or the other might have undergone a special kind of experience or feeling from within that clearly demarcates itself from all other forms of ordinary experience. And this feeling being special may be, and this feeling somehow, say, taking us inward, making us to reflect inward, may be taken as a special form of experience that we may call as a religious experience. Secondly, not all of us have similar kind of religious experience or feeling at the same time, or, or even at different time. Different people might be having different sorts of experiences that speak of touching something divine and graceful. Thirdly, the experiences that that I have cited that may be called religious, though different from one another, yet they reflect the various shades of the divinity that supplement each other and do not contradict in any way with one another. Fourthly, we being finite, we can only grasp an aspect or a shade of the divinity and not the divinity in total. But on the true realization of our own individual selves, there is an ascendance and elevation of our own individual selves to become one with the divinity, to come out nowhere to describe the divine force. And the last point that that conveys that God is a matter of direct realization through one's own self-discipline, purity, sincerity, and devotion, and it's not a matter of demonstration through logical proofs or steps of argument that we see in ontological or teleological or cosmological or moral arguments. So the religious experience, in the purest sense, may be called mystical experience. In the purest form, it is mystical experience where deeper truths are directly perceived and self-validated. Bergson speaks of partial and complete mysticism. In the partial form, the mystics work in the service of mankind and consciously attempt to sort out human miseries and pains. And mysticism in its complete form, the mystics therein elevate to become an aspect of the divinity. For Bergson, the mystic cannot become divine, rather he can only remain a part of, become an aspect of the divinity and not one with the divinity, like the way the Advaitins conceive. In the state of mystical experience, Y. Massey, he writes, quoting him, the mystics enjoy the three criteria of happiness, mental efficiency, and friendly relationship to one's fellows, unquote. It is in this experience one clearly perceives divinity or God, from which most of us are far away. The sooner we land in the mystical path, the highest form of religious experience, we enjoy the divine experience, which in itself constitutes the proof of existence of God. This is a direct proof and it requires no logical demonstration. And this sort of proof has to be directly realized by a religious person. Taking, in saying a religious person, I put forth here that a religious person doesn't mean a person belonging to any particular religion or a group or a sect. A person adhering to no religion may also be called a religious person once if he senses the divine spark within, because the divine spark is in everybody, whether he's a religious person, whether you consider him to be belonging to a particular religion or not, the divine spark is always there. So the people who realize this divine spark within, they are in the religious fold, and in their lives there are moments, there may be moments rather, which point that these moments are not the ordinary moments. These are not the moments of ordinary experience. These are the special experiences that directly reflect the existence of God. This is how we can have a direct experience of God, to prove the existence of God, to believe in the existence of God. Thank you everybody. Thank you. Over to Professor Nirupama Naik. Thank you everybody.
Yeah.
Madam.
Thank you, sir. Sir, am I audible?
हाँ ऑडिबल जे अधे गोटे अधे क्वेश्चन पचारे पे अनुरोध
ऐसा
देबे
ठीक है तो audible and
हाँ
visible
ना
both.
ठीक है बिल्कुल ऑडिबल
Okay, sir. Thank you, sir. Thank you very much, Prem Narayan, sir. And your presentation, you present the existence of the God very scrutinizedly and nicely, and about the proof regarding the existence of the God as a whole, both in the Eastern world and the Western world. Due to the shortage of the time, now I call upon the next reader.
अरे अधे अधे पचारिबानी
Sir, पचारे पर पछरे
हो
sir पछरे टाइम नहीं अभी we are already late sir.
कुआड जीवे की
Sir लंच खाया के जीवेनी आपण दीटा बेले ना आउरी जदी डेरी होबा आपण एबे भी पचारि परंती.
लक्षण किछि करनी म जोठी जीवे
Sir
सेठी
से कोनी आपा पछरे तांठो
ठीक है,
नबा हमें
ठीक है।
एही करबा सर.
अरे प्लीज प्रोसीड
सर एही सेशन पे मु भुवनेश्वर रे आपण मन को देई परबी ऑन
हो।
बिहाफ ऑफ लक्ष्मण.
हाँ थैंक यू सो मच
सर पछरे समस्त को नेक्स्ट जो फर्स्ट सेशन पर का पचारि परिबा.
प्लीज प्लीज
ना,
कॉल द नेक्स्ट
पांच जन अछंती सर. Sir, next reader is Jayanti Sahu. The concept of self in Katha Upanishad and Chandogya Upanishad, and she is from Delhi University. I request Jayanti Sahu to read out her paper. Is she present? Is she present? Jayanti madam. लक्ष्मण
जयंती कहीं नहीं तो जयंती नहीं
कहीं कोई देखा जाओ नहीं तो लक्ष्मण
ना
जयंती
से नाहंती से नाहंती नेक्स्ट
जयंती नहीं.
अच्छा. Next reader is Sandhyarani Das, BJP Autonomous College, and her paper is Good Life and Good Society in the light of the first verse of the Isha Upanishad. Very Sandhyarani.
Yes.
So please read out your paper.
Good afternoon to all. Respected the chairperson and my all teachers. My regards to all my listeners of my paper. I am going to be present a paper. The title of my paper is Good Life and Good Society in the light of the first verse of the Ishopanishad. First of all, I shall deal with two concepts, good life and good society. Then I shall try to elucidate the meaning and message of the first verse of the Ishopanishad. Lastly, I will try to examine if any link can be established among these. One of the primary aims of man is to become more and more civilized. Civilization is a social phenomenon. Good society is the mark of civilization. Moreover, a good life happens to be an essential part of a good society. Again, if the individuals do not go for good life, there cannot be a good society. A good society or a just society is that where peace and happiness are assured to individuals. It is possible when their life is secure and there is a harmonious relation with the neighbors. In that case, they would be happy with their living and their life pattern can be treated to be the examples of good life. It is seen that a good society is conditional at least two factors, namely the obligations towards the social duties and the availability of good life of the individuals of the society. But it is seen that modern society consists of a large number of various work groups engaged in various types of service. Mostly they are interdependent but lack proper interrelationship among them. The reciprocity in the ethical demand also scarcely found. Now, but modern man is becoming more Hobbesian type than Lockean type. The well-being of the society is affected due to the non-availability of good life of the individuals and also lack of moral responsibilities. The individuals, the families, the society, and relatively identifiable groups where key consideration is to cultivate the sense of duty and also developing the higher level of moral consciousness. Man must realize that he is an ethical being, having certain moral responsibilities for him and also for others. Man must realize that good life is primary aim, which in return actualize good society. But the question is, how can it be possible? Prior to the trail of finding out the solution, I want to speak few words on good life, which appears to be some extent ambiguous. My intention in saying that good life appears to be ambiguous is that under which condition a life can be treated as good life has to be decided clearly. It is because there are different opinions in this respect. Among the alternatives thought to be the key factors, some are the opinion that reciprocity for the sum bond between happiness and good life is quite strong. It is learned from Professor Mahapatra's writing that Confucius, the great Chinese philosopher, was once asked to say in one sentence what truly is the good life and true moral law. He replied in one word, reciprocity. This state in impression that good life is meant to be, and this absolutely leaves no room for discord and disagreement. In the depth of the single word lies the entire spirit of all moral theories, all religious faith, and of everything that matters in a social or societal living. This answer of Confucius appears to be quite important, though it is to be clarified further between whom the reciprocity should be there to arrive at the good life. In general, the Greek thinkers have contemplated about the good life as happy life. Dr. Das points out that according to Plato, the life guided by reason is the happy and good life. For Aristotle, happiness is whatever done in accordance with the moral excellence in intellectual virtue. Thus, happiness is good in itself. Aristotle's view on good life appears to be that it is a life of happiness. It is because he has opened that happiness or eudaimonia is the mark of happiness. If it is accepted, then pleasure would be the yardstick for good life. And this view is in no way different from the view of hedonistic stand. In this context, Professor Das points out that in Western ethics, happiness is regarded as one of the benchmarks of judging a human action as moral. If a given action maximizes pleasure and minimizes pain, then it is adjudged as good. This theory goes under the title of hedonism. Pleasure is regarded as the only intrinsic good. Plato's line of thinking appears to be somewhat different in the direction because of his remark, happiness is the consequence of pursuit of goodness. He relates happiness and goodness to be effect and cause, whereas in the Aristotelian frame, the relation appears to be cause and effect. But in both, the understanding the happiness happens to be a vital concept in the context of good life. This link with happiness is of course a significant factor, though it can be considered as uncontroversial. It is seen that it is usually the common goal of every human being to live a life without facing any scarcity of living amenities. So, affluence can be the mark of good life. This stand gives a picture that all rich people lead good life and all poor people are deprived of leading good life. But this view is not sound because it may so happen that so-called poor people may be very much satisfied with his life, whereas a so-called rich person may be very much dissatisfied with his life. So, affluence cannot be the mark of good life. Now, let us see what has been said in the very frequently quoted first verse of the Ishopanishad, which has been treated to be very high Vedantic value and values to be cultivated. The first verse says that whatever moving and changing is there in this world, ektim cha jagatyam jagat, all those are involved by or the belongings the creator. Ishabhasyam idam sharvam. The second line of the verse says that protect by developing the attitude of renunciation. Tena tektena bhunjitha. Do not covet others' wealth. Ma gridha kasya shidhanam. This verse teaches us to develop the attitude of renunciation and not to become greedy. These practices can help in protecting the self. Thus, by renunciation, protect or enjoy yourself. More clearly, it can be said that one can feel the presence of Isha in every articles of the world. And Isha is covered in all the things signifies that the Creator is not away from his creations. Ishvara is not away from his creations. He is present in all the things of the world. This world is household property. So it is foolish to become selfish or greedy to acquire more and more wealth. In general, this verse teaches us not to covet any wealth. Self-knowledge is the real method for self-protection. Self-knowledge is not possible by becoming greedy. Rather, Taga helps us for the acquisition of self-knowledge, which is the real goal of human beings. The metaphysical view expressed in the first verse that Ishvara is both transcendent and immanent. He is transcendent as creator. His presence is found with everything so that he is immanent. Thus, it supports the theory of manifested himself to the belongings of the world. We all are also his creations. So, instead of becoming selfish, we should try to get the right knowledge of the reality. The Vedantic view of this verse is that the verse teaches us the philosophy of identity in difference. The Isha is one, but he is also found as many. Ishvara is one. He can also be realized many. The real knowledge constitutes the realization of the relation between the one and the many. The most important term of this verse is Isa. The name of the Upanishad is given basing on this term. Praharaja has explained that the term Isa has the meaning, one who has infinite power. In this sense, Isa is understood as Ishvara by many. Here, it is used in the sense of the creator and the protector. It has been said in this verse that whatever small or big things we find in this world at the creation of Lord. So, all these are his properties. We can feel the presence of Lord in all his creation as the form of covering. That is why in the second line it is suggested that do not develop the attitude of collecting more and more things of the world as your own property. The wealth you see, those are not yours. If you will be greedy in accumulating wealth, then your security will be at danger. But if you develop the attitude giving up, that is Taga, then you can protect yourself or you can live peacefully. So, it is not wise to develop the attachment for the material things of the world. The ethical importance of the verse lies in the two expressions Tena tektena bhunjitha and Ma gridha kasyashudhanam. Swami Chinmayananda says that the first expression says the real enjoyment of wealth lies in the attitude of giving up. Wealth is not yours, so enjoy it by giving. It is said that lack of proper knowledge makes us greedy and we try to accumulate more wealth for us. But that is not the right course of action. The verse suggests that do not try to snatch others' wealth. Both Taga and Vairagya are very much helpful for acquiring right knowledge. Now, it is important to see the link between the message of these words and possibility of good life. At the very beginning, I would like to take up the factors of reciprocity and security. What type of reciprocity is required for good life? If you do not harm others around you, will not harm you too. This is an example of reciprocity. I hope the major prescription of this verse is to extend such type of reciprocity in every form of the relationship, that is being and Ishvara, creator and creation, man and nature, etc. In the fact, Dr. Praharaj has mentioned that environmentalists try to say that the author of Isha Upanishad in the very first verse has said about the protection of the environment. That is, the protection of environment is very essential in the sense that one can protect himself by protecting each and everything of this world. With a greedy attitude, the environment will be affected and the future greedy people is always unprotected. God has created this environment very carefully. The real knowledge constitutes knowing the real method of protecting it. Probably, no one will raise a doubt that this verse has attached emphasis on the factor of protection. How can one protect himself is well indicated in this verse. If one feels secure, then obviously he is having a good life. This verse has also attached emphasis on enjoyment through renunciation. That is, bring such type of happiness which will have a permanent effect. The happiness from other sources may be temporary. That type of permanent happiness would help in maintain a good life. If good life of individual is possible, then possibility of good society is obvious. If someone finds some other understanding from this verse, there is no objection, but that one can very well see how the Vedic seers could able to recommend methods for good life and good society cannot be overlooked. Thank you.
Thank you, Sandhya. And your paper is very nice that you have present how to lead a good life and in a good society in context to Isha and Katha Upanishad. And I think your paper is very precious and it will be open afterwards for any question. The next reader is The Problem of Universal by Lavanya Pangi, BD College, Jaipur. By Lavanya?
Yes, madam.
Can you hear me?
Good.
Okay.
Yes, madam.
Okay.
Good
Let me
afternoon.
start your paper.
Good afternoon, respected President sir, and all my teachers, and all my brothers and sisters, and also my fellow participants. I am Lavanya Pangi from final year student Bikram Dev Autonomous College. I am going to present a seminar paper on problem of universal. The problem of universal then concerns what exactly is this something. Consider a large group of caste gathered together. Thus, attractive, sensitive, and willful creatures will be found as certain features, such as similarities in appearance and behavior, which caste do not share with other animals, such as pigs. Because of this, our ordinary language, licenses, and statement all cast of something in common. But what is this something? And how do we manage to attribute it to caste and to no another creature? The main issue with respect to our something is whether to something may be called real. Of course, how this question is answered will depend on just what meant by the creature's term. Still, contemporary analytic metaphysics almost universally takes for granted that the term real, the existence and coexistence I shall argue that they are not much contemporary and
Doctor, what happened?
एक्चुअली मैडम कोन हला डिस्कनेक्ट हैला तार बधे नेट प्रॉब्लम बधे
ओहो से घर पहुंची ना
हां हां से
अब टिके आ गोटे मिनिट टाइम दबा ता संटे कथा हुआ तो
sorry madam.
हां अच्छा
हां सर ना ना
Sorry, I'm
Please
really
start
sorry,
your
madam. Much contemporary analytic metaphysics also takes for granted that there is a cell distinction between semantics and ontological questions, and that realism is a question located purely within ontology. Acceptance that the questions of what exists. I shall suggest that is as discussion of the problem of universals in favor of nominalism. It will turn out that the history of the statement of the problem of universals and of the statement of the term come to full flower amongst the scholastic philosophers, with account the most famous component, the nominalist side, arguing against the said scholastic realism of John Scott, a relation earlier. As scholasticism gave way to new, Gibbon's strength of philosophy in the early modern period, it was vainly assumed that nominalism had won the debate over universal. I would like to trace the root of the philosophical notion of concept, thereby clarifying the relation between the entities that psychologists and philosophers reference when discussing concept. It is my opinion that the conceptual scheme of the world which we embrace to this day was established by medieval philosophers. Ancient and medieval philosophers adequately described the strain of the discussion of universal knowledge, but I will ultimately refer to the work of a contemporary philosophers, Gonzalo agreed Ferreira, in order to clarify what exactly the problem of universals in and what a solution to the problem needs to be. With the problem properly understood, I can then move to cannot the historical understanding to universal to the contemporary discussion of concept. Through exploring the thinker below, I will show that much of what I have to say already been said. Having said that, crucial conceptual scheme that lies behind most discussion of the mind must be made explicit. And conceptual, this is the term location of reality, the place of established entities will within this conceptual scheme will help motivate my overall view that the philosophical statement of concepts are relevant to cognitive science. The problems, the ancient roots of realism. The problems associated with universal were discussed by both Plato and Aristotle. Both figures were considered with understanding, so we come to have general knowledge of the word. It is clear from their writing that a significant problem which both of them grappled with is that the explain how multiple particular objects in the word can be discussed using a single universal term. It is unclear how to explain our ability to see, to discuss an object of identical and some particular way as having something in common that is itself a unison all. It is what Rodriguez Ferreira 2000 discusses as the problem of the one over many. Plato's realism. Much of the discussion found it Plato's dialogues that pertains to problem of the one over many involves us emphasis on universals. How can any up to acquire general and lasting knowledge when the word from which we draw our knowledge is constantly shifting from one state to another? Clearly, we are able to make universal statement about objects in our world, and there seems to be a need for something steady and unchanging to serve as the connection between the statement and the ever-changing world. It is this need that seems to motivate realists to persist the existence of the self-subsisting existence that serves as the reference of our universal linguistic term. The Platonic solution to this claim discussed objects are similar because they partake in the same idea. I will not develop very far into the work of Plato involving this idea and will instead only address one key point of the stereotypical Platonic understanding of realism. Ideas are entities that exist outside the structural world and independent of the objects which partake of them. This is called a realist view of universals because it posits to real existence of entities over and above the objects in which we observe the universal quality. These entities are supposed to be the proper reference to the linguistic term used to indicate sometimes property, relation, or whatever else we want to attribute to multiple objects. Conclusion: the philosophical notion of concept is an abstract nation of selves as the genes of the particular concept we form. Because of this, generic uses the need to different amongst the various type of concept is various. This in own way undermines the usefulness of the generic usage, but it does not put emphasis on understanding the discursive way in which we use concept in thought. The psychological investigation of concept in purely available, and there are definitely different between the aim of philosophers and the aim of psychologists when investigating concept. Clarifying what concept is supposed, I mean, helps to show that philosophers and psychologists may be talking first each other when they disagree about that concepts are. If I have fulfilled my aim, I have shown that there is common ground between these two research programs, and we can helpfully move first polemics move towards synergism. Thank you to all.
Thank you, Lavan, for your presentation. And due to shortage of time, the question may be asked afterwards. And the next reader is Preeti Kumari. And the title of the problem is Say, the problem of universal. Preeti Kumari Hantal. Preeti, you are
Yes, ma'am.
present? Yeah.
Yes, ma'am.
Please read out your paper. And there is another reader also. So please start your paper.
Yeah, ma'am. Ma'am, start.
Oh, okay, you start.
Okay. Good afternoon, respected President Sir, and all ma'am and sir, and senior and junior participant brother and sister, and my friends. Myself, Ritu Kumar Hantal. I am final year philosophy student, Bikramdev Autonomous College, Jaipur. I am going to present a seminar paper on the problem of universal. Related and considered with what, for want of a better term, we may call the logical structure of one will interact position on some of those issues. I mean to describe this position a nominalistic, by which term I mean something rather different from what some philosophers have meant. The central questions with respect to which the view I call nominalism arise is, are any of the qualities of particular things universal, or are they all particular the philosopher who, however poor he is at providing answers, is invariably virtuous when it comes to raising questions, will immediately query with respect to my query which qualities, which particular things, what does universal mean? It's my answer to those questions may be clearly at the end of this study. For the moment, it is important to get a few preliminary questions out of the way, since the remainder of, of this will amount to an explanation of what will soon be recognized as the Leibniz or nominalism. The leader deserves to be provided with an account, however sketchy, of what we can expect to find in that Leibniz. The nominalistic position is that all the qualities of particular things are themselves particular and not universals. Having given that response, the nominalistic must justify it, prove, prove it to whatever extent he can as a philosophical analysis of qualities. Now, there are several strengths open to the nominalistic, since his ultimate aim is to deny that the qualities of particular things are non-particulars. He can adopt and rather heroic position that the qualities of particular things are not non-particular, because strictly speaking they are not anything to at all. This is the view which maintains that there is a sense in which qualities are alienable in favor of entities which are not qualities. Usually the particular things which we organize describe as having the qualities. One popular but by no means the only version of this claim has it that the qualities of particular things are really only classes or sets of those things. Such a view has been in its most basic form to be unacceptable. Plato. In the Western philosophy, Plato and Aristotle give, give the two main versions of realism. Plato is greatly influenced by Socrates in his theory of universal. His interest uh, in this sphere is aroused by Socrates, whom he makes the central character in his dialogues. Plato puts in words the idea that remains dormant in the teaching of Socrates and in his theory of ideas. He advocates the existence of universal entities which are different from the particular things of our experience. Plato maintains that there must be an essence common to all things of a given kind. It not only applies to abstract virtues like justice and courage, but also to natural objects like trees and hills and artifacts like chair and tables. For Plato. There is an absolute difference between the forms of universal and particulars. He holds that the universals are patterns in the nature of things, while the particular things are made in their image and hence are likeness of the forms. The forms exist in themselves. For Plato, the universals are substance. A substance is that which has its whole being in itself and which does not derive its reality from anything else, but it is the source, but it is the source of its own reality. It is the ground of other thing, but does not have any ground aspect itself. In this sense, the universal are self-caused and self-determined. They are absolute and ultimate realities. Their whole being lies in themselves. All things depend upon them, but they do not depend on anything. In in this technical sense, the universals are substance, the particular things, on the other hand, are not self-caused or self-determined. They are relative, they have a depend upon other things for their existence. Unlike the particular things, the universals are thought. Universals are not found in nature like any particular thing. There is no such thing as the cow in general, but that one in the case should not be taken as my thought or your thought or the thought of God, for it is abs to think that our thoughts can be the cause of the universe. It is the true that our concept are copies of the ideas, but the confuse them with the ideas themselves. It is the same as confusing of our idea of a mountain with the mountain itself, nor can we treat them as the thoughts of God. They are not subjective ideas, that is, ideas in a particular and existent mind. No, but they are objective ideas having reality on their own account independently of any mind. The universal or the idea is a unity. It is one in the midst of many, but the particular things are many. The idea of horse is one, but the horses are many. There cannot be more than one idea for every class of things. It, if there were many justice, we should have to out find out the common characteristics among them and that would constitute the one idea of justice. Ideas are immutable and impressible. A concept, a likes, a definition. The whole point of the definition is that it remains the same always, and its purpose it is to compare individual things with it and to find which with it or not. Its definition changes from time to time. It would be useless. So, if the definition of circle differs from time to time, it would be useless, as we can never say whether a figure is a circle or not. Thus, a definition is something absolutely permanent, and it is the literal expression of the nature of idea. The ideas therefore cannot change. The particular things, one on the other hand, are subject to change. They are perceivable, while the individual men take birth and die. The idea of a man remains unchanged. The idea of men is untouched by the change taken place in individual men. Many beautiful things arise the and pass away, but the one beauty neither arise nor pass away. It is something eternal, impressible, and unchangeable. The ideas are the essence of all things. The definition give out what is essential to think when we define man as a rational animal. This means that reasons is the essence of men having turn of nose, red hair, etc. and accidental, not essential to the humanity. The particular things being changeable in nature cannot to be the essence of anything. The idea is absolute perfection is in its own kind, and its perfection is the same as its reality. The perfect man is the idea of man, which is the one universal type man. And from this perfect type, all the individual men divide more or less. The particular things fall short of this perfection, and hence they are imperfect and unreal. The ideas exist outside space and time. If they were in space, then they would be found in some particular place. In that case, they would be counted as particular things, which this book, that chair, this cow, etc. They also exist outside time because they are unchangeable and eternal. This does not again imply that their term remain the same for all times. Actually, their immutability is not a matter of expression. It is known to thought. It is not only to be understood that they are always the same in time, but that the time things will be not be a table unless it has the it, essence of table food as all other tables. It may be different from other table in shape, size, and color, but it must possess a single form or essence common to them all, which constitutes their being tables them from things such as chairs, beds, and doors. Thus, Plato that holds that we always one single form for every class of particulars of which we assign the same name. It is not true only of object indicated by nouns such as chair, table, bed, trees, but also of qualities indicated by predicates such as beautiful, ugly, greater, greater than, less than, and just as. There must be a form, essence of tablehood common to table. So there must be a form or essence of ugliness common to all ugly things. There is an absolute beauty and an absolute good, and of other things to which the term many in applied. There is an absolute, for they may be brought under a single idea, which is called essence of each. Aristotle. Aristotle safely criticizes Plato's theory of universal and term it as quite unnecessary. Actually, Aristotle's metaphysics grows out of his polemic against Plato's theory of ideas, and he tries to overcome the defect found in Plato in his own philosophy. Some some of his objection against Plato's theory of ideas have been given below. Plato unnecessarily doubted the number of things to be explained. The forms or ideas are as many as the particular things whose causes are the ideas themselves. For Plato holds that there is an entity corresponding to each thing bearing the same name as it, which exists independently of the particular things of the world. Such a does not solve any problem, as it makes repetition on a different level. The questions arised in the particulars will again arise in the ideas or forms. Thus, mere multiplication of object cannot be said to be a solution to any problem. Second, Plato's ideas fail to explain the existence of things. The main problem of philosophy is to explain why the things exist here. By following Plato's theory of idea, we cannot explain this. Even if we accept that the idea of whiteness exists, we cannot see how it produce with white object. Even if the existence of things is explained, their motion is unexplained. The world of things is a world of change, motion, life, and becoming, but Plato's ideas cannot account this fact. According to Plato, the idea of whiteness produces white things, the idea of beauty, beautiful things, and so on. But since the ideas themselves are changeless, motionless, motionless, so the world of things which are their copies will be alike. Hence, the world will turn into a status one, which is an impossibility. It is clear that Plato does not make any attempt to explain the caseless becoming of the things with the explanation which whiteness produce white things, and so on. There must be explanation of why these things arise, grow of maturity, decay, and cases. To exit for this, there must be some principle of motion in Plato's ideas themselves, but this is not seen. Plato's ideas or forms are lifeless and immovable. Plato has not explained properly the relation between the ideas and particular things. He holds that particular things are the copies of ideas, and they participate in them to call the forms patterns, and the assert that other things participate in them is to talk in empty method. metaphor. In the first place, what is it that works with the ideas as model? Next, a thing can be or become like some other thing without being copied there from again if we admit that things participate in the form as in their patterns. The view as Plato holds that the ideas cause the particular things cannot be said to be true, for the ideas cannot function as the efficient cause because they are changeless pattern hope containing principle of motion. Even Plato's recognition of ideas as the final cause cannot solve the problem since it does not explain the efficient cause.
ए प्रीति तोरा केते अछि शीघ्र सार
आहुरी जणे अछंती जी
और जण अछि शीघ्र सार
प्लीज
last
video
last
only
लास्ट कंक्लूजन टिके अछि सर
ओके ओके आहुरी जणे अछंती इट इज ऑलरेडी
हाँ।
लेड मा
हाँ ठीक है last conclusion Aristotle's theory of universal is similar to the realistic theories of universals in Indian philosophy and so some respect like Aristotle the Nyaya Vaisheshika also holds that the universals do not exist independently of the particular in a word of their own. They reside in the particular things as their predicates, which provide the things with the object basic, their classification, a generalization. The Nyaya Vaisheshika, like Aristotle, holds that it is on the basic of the common characteristics of universal that we classify the device the object of the word into different group of course but the Nyaya as differed from Aristotle and coming closer to Plato holds that the universals are exactly independent of the particular although the depend on the particulars for their awareness. Ma'am? Sorry, Rama. Thank you.
Thank you, Preeti.
Thank you. Okay.
We stay in the line for future conversation. And the next reader is Rukmini Das. Rukmini Das. And the is Rukmini present?
Yes, ma'am.
yes Rukmani ji
Okay, okay. And the name title of the paper is The Concept of Illusion and Perspectives of Wittgenstein. Okay, start your paper. Start your reading.
Respected all my teachers, my dear seniors, juniors, and all my dear friends.
Rukmini, you are not audible.
Ma'am, is it audible now?
ଟିକେ ଲୋ ହଉଛି
Hello, okay, start.
Okay, ma'am.
Volume raise कर दे.
Yes, ma'am. Okay. Ma'am, now is it audible?
Okay.
ମାଇକ୍ରୋଫୋନ କ୍ଲୋଜ
ଟିକେ କିନ୍ତୁ low ହଉଛି ନା. ଦେଖି ତ.
ପାଖରେ ରଖି ପ୍ରେଜେଣ୍ଟ କର
Aଜ୍ଞା, ma'am. Yes, ma'am. So, should I start now?
okay हाँ yes
Pranam everyone, myself Rukmani Das, MA second year student from Utkal University, Banibihar, Bhubaneswar. So I would like to say thank you everyone for giving me this opportunity. As it is very late, so I will try my level best to complete it as soon as possible. So the name of my paper is The Concept of Illusion, a perspective of Wittgenstein and Shankara. Both Wittgenstein and Sankara was two prominent philosophers in their respective fields. Ludwig Wittgenstein was an Austrian-born philosopher and one of the most leading analytic philosophers. On the other hand, Acharya Sankaracharya was an theistic Vedantins and the chief exponent of Advaita Vedanta. Let's come to the what Wittgenstein's view on illusion. Wittgenstein, in his Tractatus, mentioned that all the philosophical problems arise due to the misunderstanding of the logic of language. That means if we would understand the logic of language properly, then the problem would never arise. As per Wittgenstein's view, no one can deny the fact that we suffer from illusion, which is called by him as grammatical illusion. Grammatical illusion in the sense that we are just misleading by the surface grammar and ignoring the depth structure of grammar. And these illusions are called grammatical when they arise out of the misuse misuse of language or misconceptions regarding the language. As Wittgenstein says, the illusions are created by the misunderstanding of language, which are produced by us through our inattention to the correct grammar of the language. That's why it's called grammatical illusion. Let's come to Acharya Sankara's view on illusion. If we summarize the whole doctrine of whole philosophy of Acharya Shankara, then it can be summarized into happy verse that Brahman Satya Jagat Mithya Jivo Brahmeva Napara. It means the ultimate reality is Brahman, and the world is appearance. World is an appearance, and there is no difference between the individual self and the Brahman, Paramatma. So, in other words, the world is created by Maya. That means the cosmic illusion. Maya is an Upanishadic concept which is regarded as a golden veil that covers the truth. It literally also means the illusion, and Maya connotes an illusion where things appears to be present but are not what they seem. It means a thing is present but we are just misperceive it as anything else, just like the example of rope and snake, as we misperceive the rope as a snake. That's what Sankara's view. I am just moving to the some important point where I just made the some comparison between Wittgenstein and Shankara. As I have already told, the Wittgenstein's called that illusion as grammatical illusion in the sense that we are misleading by the surface grammar and ignoring the depth structure of grammar. By surface grammar, it means the grammar in its normal or ordinary sense. On the other hand, depth grammar literally means the application of words. To understand this, we can take the example of pen exists and table exists. Both the two statements seem similar in their surface level, but in their if we analyze the depth structure, then they differ. We can explain the table, and some experimental investigation are sufficient to know the nature of table, unlike the pen. And if we see the philosophy of Acharya Shankara, then according to him, the world of plurality is not real, but an appearance. As I said, according to him, the world is mithya, appearance. So only reality is Brahman, and this world appeared to us as real, which is the result of an cosmic illusion. And also in Vedanta, Brahman is described as Satyam, Jnanam, Anantam. But to say Anantam Brahman is not similar to Neelam Mahat Sugandhim Utpalam. The sentence Neelam Mahat Sugandhim Utpalam literally means it is big and fragrant lily. In the last sentence means it is blue, big, fragrant lily. It just conveys the, it defines the substance, attribute, relations, means the nature of lily. But when we talk about the farmer, then it cannot, the sentence cannot convey the nature of Brahman, because Brahman is beyond this substance attribute relationship. So we cannot use this. Then next, come to the next point. So both for Sankara and Wittgenstein, the problem which we have been led are something like pseudo problem. For Sankara, the problem of manyness or plurality is not real. That is, the question of manyness or plurality arises only from the empirical point of view, from Vyavaharika Satta. And even when knowledge dawns, this illusion also vanishes. And on the other hand, according to Wittgenstein, all the difficulties are also unreal one, which we have created for ourselves, means if we, through our inattention to the correct structure, or inattention to the depth structure of language. And when we see the things correctly, means when we analyze the depth structure, or we know the depth structure of language, then this problem is also vanishes. Next point, both Sankara and Wittgenstein are also concerned about, within quote, freeing people, means liberation. But Sankara, Sankara wants to save everybody from the clutches of ignorance and illusions, but Wittgenstein wants to save mainly the professional philosophers from the clutches of wrong usage of language, and wants them not to be trapped by grammatical illusion. So Sankara and Wittgenstein speak of the religious salvation and academic salvation respectively. Then next point is that as in the Tractatus, proposition number 6.54, it is mentioned that anyone who anyone who understands me eventually recognizes them as nonsensical. Recognizes themselves here means the proposition of Tractatus. In a very ordinary sense, if we define it, that in order to reach at a end, we need the means, the methods, and unless we reach at the end, the means we adopted are important. But after we reach that end, this means that remains as unimportant. Like so, in Sankara's philosophy, means according to Sankara, so long as we are in this world, so we cannot take this world as unreal. This is real from the phenomenal or empirical point of view. And lastly, the distinction which can be said and which can be shown, means saying and showing, we find in the very prominent role in Wittgenstein's philosophy. In so other words, saying can be equivalent to that of describing. Describing means Wittgenstein identifies what can be said, means said means which is capable of being true or false, with the proposition of natural science. And the distinction between saying and showing is also explained by Sankara. According to him, Brahman can never be described by words. It can be shown by the method of adhyaropa, means superimposition, and apavada, negation. Brahman appears as the world of plurality because of adhyaropa, and it is due to adhyaropa that the real appears to be unreal. By adopting the method of negation, means apavada, which involves the discrimination, the attributes of the not self are eliminated to reveal the self. That means by adopting the method of apavada, we can eliminate the not self from the self. So from the above analysis, we can conclude that though both Wittgenstein and Sankara belong to two different backgrounds, still their view are much similar. And Wittgenstein basically deals with the grammatical illusion, and Sankara deals with cosmic illusion. Wittgenstein held that the grammatical illusion can be vanished by understanding the logic of language. On the other hand, Sankara holds that this illusion can be vanished by right knowledge. Thank you.
Thank you, Rukmini. And your paper is very informative, and it is expressed between the appearance and reality. A comparison, a very good comparison between Wittgenstein and Sankara, Adi Sankara. Okay, Rukmini. Sir, Lakshman, now the paper may open for comment.
ଆଉ ଓପନ ଡିସ୍କସନ କରିବା ନା ଟାଇମ ହେଲାଣି ଲଞ୍ଚ
ନାଇଁ
ପାଇଁ
ଚାର୍ଟ ରେ କଣ ଅଛି? ଚାର୍ଟ ରେ କ୍ୱେଶ୍ଚିନ୍ ଆସିଥିବ ନା?
ନାଇଁ ନାଇଁ ଚାର୍ଟରେ କିଛି କ୍ୱେଶ୍ଚିନ୍ ଆସିନି।
ମାନେ ସାର୍ ଙ୍କୁ ବି ଆସିନି କେ ନାରାୟଣ ସାର୍ ଙ୍କୁ?
ନାଇଁ ନାଇଁ କିଛି ଆସିନି।
କିଛି ଆସିନି? ସାର୍ ସାର୍ ଅଛନ୍ତି ଗଣେଶ ସାର୍? ସାର୍ କିଛି କ୍ୱେଶ୍ଚିନ୍ ନାହିଁ?
ଯାହା କ୍ୱେଶ୍ଚିନ୍ ଥିଲା ଚାଟ୍ ବକ୍ସ ରେ ସଲ୍ଭ ହେଇଗଲାଣି।
ସଲ୍ଭ ହେଇଗଲାଣି? So very good sir. So sir, can I give the thanks?
Yes,
ଖାଲି ପ୍ରୀତିକୁ କେବଳ ଗୋଟେ କଂଗ୍ରାଚୁଲେସନ କରିବାର ଅଛି।
ସାର୍ କୁହନ୍ତୁ।
ନା ମୁଁ କିଛି କହିବାର ନାହିଁ, ରୁକ୍ମଣୀ କି କେବଳ କଂଗ୍ରାଚୁଲେଟ କରିବାର ଅଛି।
ସାର୍ ସେଇଆ ମୁଁ ତ କହୁଥିଲି।
Thank you, sir.
ନାଇଁ ଏବେ ବିଡି କଲେଜରେ ବି ସେମାନେ ନୂଆ ପିଲା ହେଇଥିବେ।
ତା ସାଙ୍ଗରେ ପରେ ଟିକେ ଆଲୋଚନା ହବ, କିନ୍ତୁ ବର୍ତ୍ତମାନ ପାଇଁ ହାଇ କଂଗ୍ରାଚୁଲେସନ୍ସ।
Okay.
Thank you, madam, for your nice chairing this session. And I also express a heartfelt thanks to all the paper presenter and the participant. And now this session is over. We will again meet at sharp 3 p.m. For the.
Thank you very much. And I think this is a very cheerful and decent session for me.
Next academic session, logic and metaphysics.
Okay.
And this session will chair by the Professor Ganesh Prasad Das. And I request all of you to rejoin within 2:50, so that at a sharp 3 p.m. we will start the next session.
ଅଧଘଣ୍ଟାରେ ତମ ରୋଷେଇ କରି ଖାଇ ଆସି ହବ ନା?
ମୋ ପାଇଁ କିଛି ଅସୁବିଧା ନାହିଁ।
ସାର୍ ନମସ୍କାର।
ହଁ ନମସ୍କାର।
ଭେଟ
ହବ ଆର ବେଳେ ଭେଟ ହବ।
ସାର୍ ଆପଣ ଭଲ ଅଛନ୍ତି ତ?
ହଁ ଭଲ ଅଛି।
ନାଇଁ ପାଣିଗ୍ରାହୀ ସାର୍ ପଚାରୁଛନ୍ତି ନିରୁପମା ମ୍ୟାଡାମ।
ପାଣିଗ୍ରାହୀ ସାର୍ ପଚାରୁଛନ୍ତି?
ପାଣିଗ୍ରାହୀ ସାର୍ ମ୍ୟୁଟ ରେ ଅଛନ୍ତି, ସାର୍ ଅନମ୍ୟୁଟ କରି କହିଲେ।
ସାର୍ ନାହାନ୍ତି କି? ମ୍ୟୁଟ ରେ ଅଛନ୍ତି। ଓକେ।
ପାଣିଗ୍ରାହୀ ସାର୍ ମ୍ୟୁଟ। ହଉ ଠିକ ଅଛି।